she talked about what? So you have those connections. And bigger than that, I'm from Nashville as well. So just reading about, and I've never been able to eloquently explain to people what Nashville used to be. So post, pre-Tennessee Titans and the Nashville Predators, it wasn't that. And it was a city separated by the North and the South, and you so eloquently described our experience. So if you have not had an opportunity to read Emily's book, we're going to try to unpack it as much as possible. You all know that I'm a reader. For those who have been to a Wine Words event before, you know I'm a reader. So I won't spoil things for you, but just to have enough for you to understand why we love this book so much. So, Emily's life is very interesting, and I found it a unique space in literature for this book, because we always read about, or even in media, we see the duality of the Black experience, where you have to code switch for corporate America, and then you go to your Black community with your Black family, and you're living your Black life, or you are stereotypical hood in your Black experience and get thrown into a very white world where you have to figure out and fumble, and so those seem to be very common themes in our culture as far as what's getting published and what's being read. Your experience is very different. You have a very firm, strong African American heritage that you know about. It's not like it was a secret. You generations know of your history of your family, and you selected going up north, and you picked your environment. And what came across is you write in an unapologetic way about your experience, where I feel some authors feel burdened to kind of explain or over-explain, and then I was like, well, maybe that's not true for her. Maybe you do have the burden, you just didn't write from that perspective. So.
Well, I mean, I love everything you're saying, and I was very conscious as I was putting this book together. So I started the book just a series of independent essays. I really didn't think of myself as writing a book. And the first essay that I wrote that became part of this collection was an essay called Teaching the N-Word, which I wrote in response to a class I was teaching at UVM. It was me in a classroom full of 10 lovely white students. And we were teaching African American autobiography. So the ironies just began, the first day. And, the word comes up in our reading. And I just decided that I was going to write about the experience as it was. And I wasn't going to give a lecture about it, because, what happens, of course, in our culture is that some white person says the word, and then, goes on Oprah or an equivalent, and a grand mea culpa, I'll never do it again.
Right.
And that person may or may not get their career back.
Right.
And then it happens again, And so there's a way that the lectures just aren't working. And I was really interested then in the kind of question of what is so compelling about that word.
Right.
And so I decided, when I very much think of myself as a teacher, but in the classroom, and I teach at the University of Vermont, so my students come in, I have, I'm lucky if I get 4 or 5 students.
I love how you say, I may be the first Black teacher they've ever had.
Some of them, I tell a story in here about I had a white student who had never talked to a Black person before. She was in my class, but when she came to UVM, she fell in with this really fantastic, vibrant group of young Black women who thought of her like this, like she was uniform, right? It's like, how is that possible? So when she was in my class, they would prompt her to tell the story, because that was hilarious.
Right.
And she said that she had seen a Black man once at a bus station stop, and she wanted to speak to him, but there was no ruse,
Right.
So anyway, so that was a long time ago, but I'm very aware. I mean, that's the story of higher education in this country. It becomes more and more expensive and more exclusive, In some variety, we're dealing with that. So I'm always very conscious of what I represent to the students, and I write about that too, the way I dress, and that essay that, I never come to class in jeans, that's just not, that's not something I would ever do, because when I'm in that classroom, I realize what I'm representing, and I'm there thinking of my grandmother and my great-grandmother, and what it means for them, for me to be in that room.
Right.
But when I go into the class, the students start sometimes below zero, so I have to tell them things, I'm
Right.
starting with the tradition, I'm ending up, and they have to come out with some knowledge, but the essay form for me, or me as the writer, I get to meander, and I get to contradict myself. And so even in the essay, the structure,
Gotcha.
I wanted there to be gaps, because
Yes.
I said, I'm not gonna give you a lecture, because again, the lecture's not working.
Yes.
The short answer is no, don't say it.
Right.
I have enough of a reputation at my school now that the students don't come to me and ask that question, like, they know what I'm gonna say.
Right.
I'll say, and I'll say to my students of color too, say what you like, but know that no one was ever lynched being called Mr. Johnson.
Right.
So that's the history that word carries, and
Right.
for, I have students, well, I'm not responsible, well, we're all responsible for history. History made us. We don't get to decide, what part we want, what we don't want. And I'll also say, sure, language is elastic, and I would never tell someone what to say, but as my grandmother would say, don't
Right.
write a check with your mouth that your behind can't cash.
Yes.
Say, now go forth.
Right. But you've been warned. You have been warned.
And I have no choice.
I love how you made your class everyone's class, because so many times when you get titles of African American literature, it's like, oh, this is the white people's class, or the Hispanic diaspora, oh, this is only for Latinos, when it's an American story. And in order for your students who may not be of color to connect with the story, they have to own it, own the responsibility of it's a part of their telling as well.
And I think it's a delicate thing, because, I always tell my students, they come in and say things like that, white students, well, I don't understand this, I don't understand, how can I understand Frederick Douglass?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, well, I was never a slave in the 19th century, so this experience,
Right.
I don't carry it,
Right.
but at the same time I do, so.
Right.
But the essay is really that question, like, I am a human being, and I'm a black human being,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a woman, and I bring that with me everywhere I go.
Mhm.
But I'm also a teacher, and you are not entitled to my personal experience. And in some ways, the book, what you were saying at the beginning is exactly the dilemma I had, and I think it took me a long time, because I love that you see this. I think of my experience in some ways as, an African American as not as sort of typical.
Right.
And that we live race, as you say,
Mm-hmm.
it's always shifting,
Mhm.
right? It's never exactly, we're not living blackness in capital letters all the time.
Right.
Sometimes we're living in other ways, and
Right.
we're just trying to go to the bank.
Right.
And,
Right.
I'm with my friend, a woman that is my kind of a mentor, she says, I just went out of the race business, I'm on vacation, So, but I wanted to tell that story, and I think I internalized in some ways that mandate, or what you were talking about, the ways that our stories are often, they have become so public.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
I also am suspicious sometimes of the publishing industry.
Yes.
Because you wonder, what kind of stories are people investing in?
Yes.
And
Yes.
to what degree are our struggles becoming literally something people want to consume?
Yes.
And with every video we can see now, some of that reflect on that, it just, what does it mean that we can watch someone being killed in real time?
As it's happening.
As it's happening.
Yes.
And on one hand, I think about, Emmett Till's mother, who insisted that the world witness, her son's bloated, battered body, and said, you must witness this.
Right.
And how it started a movement, really. On the other hand, I think, again, it's somewhat,
Mm-hmm.
who's watching these videos just like pulling up with a bowl of popcorn?
Right.
And saying,
Right.
let me watch this.
As if it was fiction.
As if right, and it's just like, oh, kind of
Right.
a thrilling story.
Right.
So, I just one story. It kind of kept me questioning about what my book would contribute, because the stories of the struggles are important. And I didn't experience the things that we often see out there.
Mhm.
Is my story,
Right.
is it black? Is it even black?
Right.
Right. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Is it doing
Yes.
that work?
Yes.
To intervene. But then
But it's so very black, and that's
Yeah,
what
I agree.
I love about it, is because you don't apologize for, you didn't grow up in the hood, you didn't have to strive and overcome, and not that those stories are insignificant.
Right.
It's just that we're not monolithic in that way, and so if there isn't a space for your story,
Right.
then what is the space about? And I actually wrote, I said, it's unique because we all know the person who's the black woman in the room, but we've never read that story. And we don't know what it's like for you to travel in that sphere all the time.
Yeah.
So it's easy because you write about people popping into your life and making assumptions about it, like because you're married to a white man, and so they make this assumption of what type of black you have to be to marry outside of your race, or what type of black you have to be to live in Vermont, and they're so very wrong. And but I mean, we are full of assumptions about people, and so when you contrast that with the grace in which you accept it, because my head would have spun around like a couple of times in this book, but you have such wonderful grace for people and their questions and their curiosity. And the courage to write this part of the story, the African American story, because I think people take for granted, I think non-blacks take for granted the black person in the room as being comfortable.
Yes, I agree.
All the time.
All the time. They have no idea about our interior experience. I agree. And I like that, so you're right, interracial marriage, and I wanted to write an essay that, responded to, and in the essay, literally, a friend of mine who is Mexican American, I think I hope it now heard they call it something else, asked me once, recently, like, what is it like being married to a white man? And it was just this kind of extraordinary question, because at the time my husband, we were trying to exchange keys to get the kids. It's like, well, I mean, it's like being married to somebody who has my key. Right. Also, I think when people, again, the assumptions is one that his family was the one who had to be won over. But in fact, it was my family. I had to, my aunts and my uncles, and
your dad is my dad. Because I was in love with Duran Duran, and I kept saying to my dad, I'm marrying Simon Le Bon, bring him home, get ready for our British babies. And my daddy was like, nope, that's not why I had you. You are not married outside of your race. And it took a while of, Dad, just listen to Duran Duran. You're going to love him. And that's a comical view, but I had those conversations.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I think, same thing with and I write about this, my beloved father, very old school, very, West Indian patriarch, and my daughter is going to do this, and she's going to do this, and, I got old.
Yeah.
And he was like, just please marry someone.
Right. Different set of concerns.
I found something with my husband, his Italianness, and the food, so that's what really.
Yes.
But people, again, the assumptions, my husband, in some ways, our biggest issue is class, which I don't know if I explained, because my husband's family, they immigrants, and they didn't go beyond the 8th grade. My parents went to Meharry, and so that's also, that's our story, right?
Right.
Two-parent home with the parent, this kind of thing.
Forever two-parent home.
That is our story, and so again, I am amused sometimes by the assumptions, because if anything, our class differences sometimes surprise me, because it's something, I don't think about.
Right.
But my husband, even recently, my daughter's, I went to take him to the doctor. He's like, you're always going to the doctor. And I said, my father was a doctor. They're at our disposal.
Right.
For him, going to the doctor,
it's a big
imagine
thing.
for your father who did not speak English well, had a 3rd grade education. It was a big deal, but it's not, So it's interesting to me how we relate as individuals, and then even more broadly, the ways that race can appear and reappear in a relationship. Sometimes it can be defining, and sometimes it can just recede. And even with my children, we adopted our daughters, they're born in Ethiopia. And watching them evolve, which is a huge reason I wrote the book, because I was so interested, the stories I carry from my ancestors. They're so alive, for so many of us. I mean, in the course of thinking about this book, I thought, there's stories about my grandparents' marriage that I tell that feel fundamental to me about who I am and the choices. But I wasn't there. So they don't really. It's just my imagination. But now as my kids get older and they start to tell stories, thinking, oh, that's what they're picking from. To say, well, this is why I do what I do, because it's different than my mother. And also watching them experience blackness, you know.
Yes.
I grew up in a home, my parents, you know, would say, my mother was, and I would say, Mom, that everything is about race. And now I find myself, my daughters have to bite my tongue sometimes. They'll say something happened at school and I'll say, oh, really? Teacher again, what does she look like? And so I'm kind of, you know, and I'm there and trying to, recently I just have to tell a story of my daughters, so watching them now, they're 13, and so they're a lot older than.
Right, and they're twins.
And they're twins. So my daughter was in, and thinking about race in Vermont, was in Old Navy. And she called me, she was with a girlfriend who was biracial, very light skinned, and in fact had her hair blonde at some point. They were good, really good friends. And I always think of this girl as black.
Right.
You know, we've never talked about it, but I always think of her that way. So they were in Old Navy, and my daughter Isabella was, you know, they have those, you're checking out all the perfumes. So
Yes.
her friend Olivia was spraying, you know, fooling around there at 13. And a white woman behind her said to my daughter, who's very brown skinned, and said, if you're not going to buy that, please stop spraying it. So my daughter said, well, I wasn't even spraying it. But of course, she calls me. And she said, Mommy, this happened to me. And my first response was, is she still in the store?
Right. Right.
So I got But her response was, you know, she said to me immediately, because I always will say to them, you know, I've got my back.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And she said, Mommy, I don't want you to go around scaring people. And I thought to myself, though, what am I bringing with me to these experiences, right?
Right.
My history.
Right.
And she wanted a chance to figure out for herself. And she said, you know, do you think that she spoke to me this way because my skin is brown? And I said, this woman sounds like a miserable person. And, you know, she said the daughter had looked sympathetic. I said, yeah, you're right. I said, here's one thing I'm going to tell you. Don't ever question yourself. Because, you know, isn't that, you know, I think sometimes we're told, are you sure? You know, we internalize that, right? Am I sure? And that is, of course, the experience, I think, of living in our bodies. That you never really, you know, why. But I thought, that's what I want, you know, even if they kind of have to shoot first and take names later.
Yes.
I want them to feel confident that their reading of the situation is correct. Because I don't want them to have, it's too hard already, growing up hyper-visible in these spaces. And we revisit it all the time, you know, they're like, what are we doing here? So we'll talk about that. And I always have an eye, frankly, on the door.
Right.
You know, I don't want them to, I want them to live full lives. I mean, right now, what we're doing is traveling.